Howdy, all you delicious people. I am here today to review the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the original film, the 1974 original thing. Because I don't know how many goofy jumping through hoops things that this technical franchise has gone through. Like, there has been technically 3 to 4 some odd reboots. There have been, I think, 1 to 2 prequels. There have been just a bunch of stuff that they had tried to do to just kind of eventually just like continue to get money kind of being put into this whole thing, and they have just continued to just like seemingly at some points in time gotten just enough money together, I guess, to keep this thing alive for whatever reason. So going into this, I went into IMDb TV because I had to forcibly have that app anyways for my tablet, and I ended up just being easily be able to watch this movie for free. Like evidently, like even IMDb doesn't even know which Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie this was. I think they ended up saying that this. I think the one that they got said the year that this came out was like 2014, but I think they ended up doing some like anniversary edition of this movie, and so that's I guess where they got confused about. But that just confused the heck out of me because I'm like, so what version of this is there? Because there's just a ton. So what are my thoughts in this movie? How did I overall feel about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre film, the original? I honestly would say that I've probably watched a number of Rob Zombie kind of films and whatever, and like House of a Thousand Corpses, what have you, and all this kinds of stuff. And eventually, maybe I'll review that stuff at some point. Eventually, somewhere down the road, maybe next October, or probably just any random Tuesday or whatever, because eventually I'll just start to like run out of content. I'm like, let's just put this out there. Maybe that'll tweak people's interest. So I watched this movie, and I would honestly say that I just didn't like this film. More than likely, for anybody who is a Texas Chainsaw Massacre fan, more than likely they'll just be like, well, wait a minute, you went into the wrong one. The one that you should go into is this one, or the one you should at least watch is this one. Like, I'm sure there's probably somebody that has their own personal favorite, or there's somebody that might just say, oh, well, this one's definitely better. This second shot of reboot is probably better. Maybe someone will say the more current one is their favorite, or whichever. Some people might have a personal favorite of some random thing that ended up coming out somewhere for this whole franchise of things. And so I would say that's great. Eventually I'll have to figure that out when eventually I go and put this and upload a video of this out there. So let me know in the comments below whichever iteration of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, whether it was Texas Chainsaw, whether it was the new generation, whether it was Leatherface, whether it was Texas Chainsaw Massacre the beginning, or any number of freaking titles that this has gone through a massive amount of time, of which that it has gone into several different iterations of goofy things, and so many things that they had to retcon along the way. So I just didn't enjoy this movie. Like, to me, I didn't really like grasp or understand the film. Like, to me, like, also, like, the way of which that this movie was to present itself, I was like, this just feels like another Rob Zombie film. This just feels like I'm watching a Rob Zombie film, weirdly. It's like I'm watching like 31 without the whole like death game that ends up weirdly coming out of that. If you've ever watched the Rob Zombie movie 31 and then you watch this movie, like it'll like 31 will just blow your mind, because like I think 31 is a really great underrated film. that not a lot of people know exist. Um, but uh, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre feels similar to that, to where eventually all of a sudden these people are to be put against the odds eventually when we get there. Because this is like an hour and 20 some odd minute movie, and it's a slow to crawl film. And like really there's a lot of points in time in this movie where there's obviously a lot of characters that I don't really enjoy, because why would I? And I've said, I've seen kind of a lot of Rob Zombie films where there are some unsavory characters or some people that push buttons and stuff like that. But like when I was to just kind of watch this movie, I just kind of felt like this is the Friday the 13th candy bar movie to me, where like this just seems kind of like a goofy slasher film. Like I didn't feel like this was like a actual legitimate like slasher film to me. This felt like a goofy variation of it. And I was like, okay, like are they ever gonna take anything serious? And it was like, no, like it just continued to just be more and more of a goofy thing. So I don't know, I was kind of hoping for a much more like less goofy variation in this movie, but I couldn't seem to like find that. So eventually, maybe I'll find like a much more a serious take on this, even though that seems weird to ask for. Uh, I don't know. To me, there was too much like, especially towards the end, where like Leatherface bizarrely has this like clown for a face mask. And I'm just like, okay, I guess this is just some weird, goofy thing. And especially when they end up having like the grandfather who ends up having the hammer in his hand, and I'm just like, okay, like this could be like this could be like a funny spot for whatever reason, but I'm just like during this point, I was just like, man, like we're really getting some territories here. We're really getting some stuff done in this. We really just like also the movie is to say chainsaw in it, right? Isn't to have the whole point of this movie to murder every single person with a chainsaw? I don't know. I just kept seeing ka-clunk, ka-clunk, ka-clunk. I'm like, where's the chainsaw? And I don't know. It just seemed that, it just seemed that this movie just kind of felt like a little bit too like rando, and I wanted to like have it all like connected somehow, but we like weren't gonna get that. Like, I honestly I think there was one movie that I think was the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, like the beginning, where I think Leatherface was to have like a job working at this like slaughterhouse, and I was thinking like, you know what, that could have been a perfect way to help us understand why Leatherface was to eventually go and kind of take out people the way he does. Like weirdly they end up doing this kind of thing where they end up having to bring up why Leatherface is to smack people with hammers, because evidently they that was the way in which that they ended up having to like kill cattle and smack them over the head with hammers. um, but I guess nowadays they end up kind of taking them and using some kind of weapon that you actually do get to see in the It remake, where eventually they use the same kind of weapon to kill off certain kind of animals in that movie, uh, where you hear them kind of explain that in this spot here. So yeah. So with that said, I didn't like this movie, but I just don't know why I didn't like it. It's bothering me how, like, I was just like, I felt like this movie was far too, like, in my head, I was thinking, like, man, this movie is far too goofy and, like, far too, like cheaply made in my mind, and that's horrifying. And that's horrible to say, um, because I'm possibly thinking that they probably put a lot more money into any number of any of these things. But also, when really just looking at it, I'm like, there's possibly so many things that I can eventually have gone into and not felt this way, or I could have gone through any number of reboots and whatever that they have done through time, because there's two of them, and more than likely I could have gone into the Jessica Biel Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie, and I could have liked that more. Maybe, I don't know. I eventually will probably have to eventually explore the Texas Chainsaw Massacre world to eventually see if there are to be movies that I will enjoy more. Man, if Rob Zombie eventually does a Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie, I think I would actually watch that, because I think Rob Zombie does kind of do movies like that anyways. So I would kind of wonder what his spin of the character kind of is. But like, I also want to really just want to watch like Texas Chainsaw Massacre the beginning, because I kind of like that kind of approach to actually have us understand Leatherface eventually going and working at a slaughterhouse, because I think that's actually a good idea for having him have the weaponry and whatever that he does, and maybe even the kind of skill set this character has. So, teeing it up, what is this movie about? Well, it seems that we end up having a character named Sally, who is to, I guess, have heard through the grapevine that her grandfather's grave was to have been vandalized, or was to be like done something with, and so her and some of her friends end up deciding to eventually go off and go onto this road trip to this gravesite, and then eventually they decide to also head back to this uh, farmhouse of theirs. And all of a sudden, once they end up heading back to this farmhouse, eventually, I guess the neighbor that is to be next to this farmhouse is to, of course, be Leatherface and his family. And so we end up kind of also, before we even get to the part of Leatherface's home, we eventually meet a unsavory character. I guess I don't know. Like, really, when I've seen so many Rob Zombie films, like, this is kind of like usual for me to eventually kind of see a guy that pushes things far too far. To where eventually they're just like, yeah, you know what? Like, how about you just get out of my car? Because you're too weird. You're a little bit too crazed for me. So, uh, but yeah, so going in here, I think that's all that I have to just kind of eventually say about this film. Overall, I think it's just about that nick of time to just otherwise say that it's about spoiler time. So let's get into it. Let's just go into just going on where to go and see this. I went and saw it on IMDb TV. You could probably go and like Amazon search this or whatever. More than likely, based on my opinion, especially more than likely, I would probably say maybe give certain other Texas Chainsaw Massacre things a try before going into this one. But I don't know. Like, it seems people hold this movie up to a very high regard compared to all the others. Maybe it's just that all the others just suck poorly. I don't know. I like. I think I remember seeing the Jessica Biel Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie, but like I don't remember a single thing from that film. There's nothing that I can pull from that where I'm just like, yeah, like that felt like a thing that I had to remember at some point. So eventually I might have to go and re-explore that movie to eventually just be like, well, I guess I can probably like the overall approach of the film. Um, but like I guess I would have to go and watch the beginning movie that ties into that rebooted thing to only have two movies to just kind of go into because yeah. Uh, Anyways, so yeah, uh let's go into that double five. Let's otherwise say that it is spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time we can do spoil this movie. Um, I regret I regret saying that I don't like this film. I so badly regret it. But I don't like it. It's my opinion. Um, I like Rob Zombie films. This isn't it. Uh, like I don't even know how I feel about the Halloween Rob Zombie film. Maybe I should finally watch that because I never have. I think I've seen bits and pieces of it. So maybe I should. I definitely should at some point go and watch that film just so I could say, yeah, this Halloween movie way better than the original one, or maybe because like I remember me saying like, yeah, I don't ever want to go and see the Jamie Lee Curtis original Halloween movie. I don't want to see it again. I never want to see it in its entirety. I would rather just come under the second half of it or towards the end and just be like, okay, well I've seen this. Uh, like I never want to see that full version again. So going into this, so like I said, kind of teeing it up. So I'm not going to re-go through and say what all I said there. Like I think I'll get to a point where I'll kind of just stop and then like go into a point of which that will get us to the Leatherface house. So we'll get to that. So this group of people had gone to this grave site, and then they are to be driving to their old farmhouse. And so while they're doing this, they are to eventually bump into a character called Hitchhiker. They seriously don't have a name for this guy in the movie. They just call him Hitchhiker? Good God. Oh, well, I guess. Whatever. Like, here's the goofy thing. So, we end up having one guy who's just called Old Man, and then we have another guy called Grandfather. Wow, that really helps frickin' IMDb. Thanks. Like, or really just thanks for, like, this movie who just didn't even try to, like, besides Leatherface, they just didn't really care about names, I guess, for this film. Besides any of the people who are eventually to die for whatever reason. So, uh, so eventually these guys are to pick up this hitchhiker because who ends up having this like weird red like line of thing upon his face. You would assume that more than likely he had probably just cut open his face and then eventually the thing just healed, or maybe he just loves to just put red paint on his face every morning. I don't know. Um, but we end up having this hitchhiker, and so this one guy, Franklin, was going and talking because he's in a wheelchair. He was talking to all these friends, and he was to eventually, while they're kind of driving through uh, and traveling, this guy is just making small talk about the whole like new weaponry that they're eventually to use on cattle to eventually kill them off. And so instead of like they used to use some hammer and smack them and try to get one fell swoop to kill these cattle off so that way they wouldn't feel the pain. And so now they end up using this one gun to go and like put like some kind of spike through these cattle's head and kill them off. But then supposedly Franklin is to also say there's several times where like a cattle probably won't realize it's like dead till far after it's been skinned and whatever. So Anyways, so when this hitchhiker is to go uh, onto this car, all of a sudden Franklin is to tell this guy this same exact thing because I guess this guy had nothing better to say. But then, hey, you know the hammer and the cattle weaponry thing? Like, I'm going to reiterate this whole line and stretch and whatever to eventually have this guy have something in rebuttal to possibly say here. So, but eventually, after this whole dialogue eventually starts to play out, eventually Franklin is to have this knife on hand. And so the hitchhiker is like, hey man, could I see that knife? And Franklin is like, well, sure. What are you going to do with it though? So we have this hitchhiker who is to take the picture of Franklin and is to ask for $2. And so, like, dude, we're not going to give you $2 for this, like, photo. Like, this isn't Terminator Judgment Day 2, where eventually you're going to try to, like, try to get money out of us by taking a picture of somebody. So, eventually the guy goes and is to burn the photo, and then he ends up putting it back into his little weird uh, animal skin purse or wallet, whatever the heck weird thing that he has over his necklace. I don't know if that's a purse or whatever that is. It's so weird looking. But this hitchhiker eventually ends up taking Franklin's knife and ends up going and stabbing it into his hand. And so all of a sudden, this guy is starting to bleed. And so they're like, okay, I think this hitchhiker guy, I think he needs to go. I think we're just going to go ahead and open up our door and just kick him the F out because this guy is too weird. So eventually what ends up happening is that these people are to eventually uh, go on and to make it to their old farmhouse. And so eventually after making it to this old farmhouse, they end up going and eventually making it into Leatherface's home. So the very first guy who is to eventually make his way into Leatherface's house mistakenly, because he makes the mistake, is to, of course, be this guy named Kirk. So Kirk is to all of a sudden just kind of see, like, hey, is anybody in this house? Maybe I'll check some things out. Maybe I'll just go and just. So weirdly, we have Kirk who ends up going into this room that's filled with all these, like, animal heads. And so all of a sudden, Leatherface ends up showing up, smacking him with his hammer. Kirk falls over and he's like jiggling to death. And I'm just like, what? Like, this guy just gets hit with this hammer and he's jiggling to death? Like, okay, all right. Like, this just seems weird. And I'm like, where's the chainsaw? But then I'm just consistently asking myself that through a bulk of this movie. But then I'm like, well, wait a minute. Like, chainsaws are hard to do in a film. And eventually, like, when really just looking at it, I'm like, you know what? Like, it's okay that it seems like the chainsaw thing was a clickbaiting thing. Because at least no one was to get hurt, hopefully, during this film. As well as, like, really just everybody was to just kind of be eventually going in and doing more chainsaws after this first movie is to be done with. So, because eventually maybe they couldn't come up with a safer way to do any number of these things, so they're just like, we're not going to do this. Anyways, so all of a sudden, that is to eventually lead still more people, eventually one by one, heading into this home. So eventually that either leaves both Jerry or Pam to eventually go and head into this home. So I think it's Pam shortly thereafter this, where she ends up going into the house and just like just stumbling in the house. And so Pam ends up doing almost the exact same thing that Kirk ends up doing. So this time around, Leatherface is to eventually go and grab Pam and kind of shove her onto this hook, and I'm like, oh, she got hooked. Like, oh my god, that looks awful. Because when you're really just like in your mental thought of process, you're wanting to make this seem more horrific than it actually is. To really just be like, hey man, like somebody's hanging there and they have like a hook in their back. Like just kind of think of like, uh, God, what is that one movie? Or the one game, Dead by Daylight, where eventually the one person ends up getting hooked into that one thing, and then all of a sudden, like the three pronged devices are coming at them, and like the person is trying to hold it off until eventually someone could unhook them and whatever, and then eventually they get off to eventually either escape or eventually just get consumed by this hook device dealio. Um, so hey, if you don't have this Leatherface movie, you probably don't have Dead by Daylight, or whatever that game is with the all the slashers and whatever. Was there an actual Leatherface like DLC for that game? You would have thought they would probably have had one. That would have made a lot of sense, right? But it seems like they had basically everything else, right? They've had like a Freddy Krueger DLC and all kinds of other goofy stuff. Like they have like a Saw DLC and all kinds of whatever. It's been a while since I've seen that. I played that game. Anyways, so Pam ends up getting hooked, and then eventually she ends up getting some chopped up. So eventually we have Jerry, the goofy looking cat with like this big just thing of hair. Much respect to Jerry because this guy just has some goofy glasses and goofy hair, and he just goes in to Leatherface's home to eventually just get some hammer time going on with him. So eventually now it's just left with Sally and Franklin because everyone is basically killed at this point. So one way or the other, because Jerry ends up going into Leatherface's home, and he ends up going and like he gets some really good time in this home compared to the other people, and so Jerry eventually finds Pam in this freezer. And so he tries to get her out of the freezer, but like she's already dead, buddy. And so eventually that's of course when Jerry ends up getting clocked and he ends up getting freaking just like, yeah, you're gonna die, buddy. You're gonna die. So eventually Sally and Franklin are just like, man, like, where is all of our friends at this point? Like, why are they all gone? And so eventually when things start to really just pop off and Leatherface is to just kind of eventually go on and eventually just start going after people. Like both Sally and Franklin like are to try and honk the horn onto their car to eventually get their friends to come back, but nobody ever does. And so eventually Franklin and Sally are trying to think of what to do. And so there's nothing for them to really do because they don't have the keys and they don't know where their friends are to eventually get the keys. So and this is taking far too long. So eventually, Leatherface is to eventually show up and basically chop Franklin in half, wheelchair and all. And then so now Sally's to be the only one left. She's to technically be the final girl of this movie because we always have to go with a final girl weirdly scenario. So now, Leatherface is just chasing Sally through this forest, this random forest of all this stuff. I wonder if anybody got, like, freaking, like, any kind of hurt during this whole scene where it's just, like, going through this huge brush of random crap. So, like, we can just kind of go here and eventually have Sally just kind of going through this whole brush. Leatherface is chopping his way through this whole thing. And so Sally just gets a pretty good head and shoulders like away from Leatherface, and then eventually stumbles upon this one uh, like store of sorts, where eventually she is to talk to this old man. Come to find out that this old man is to, of course, be tied to Leatherface, and so eventually what ends up happening is that Sally eventually ends up getting knocked out, and then eventually she is to be at this dinner table with Leatherface and family, weirdly enough. So we have it to where eventually at some point Sally is just screaming her head off, and I'm just like, God, this, like, it's starting to get annoying the numerous times this woman is screaming. And but when looking at any horror movie, how many times would a person, like, I remember watching like, cause I would watch like the Hostel movies. I've seen those where eventually, like, I think we have it to where I think like the third one, where we just have a girl just screaming her head off repetitiously for a good solid number of minutes, and I'm just like, God, do we really have to, like, do we really have to have this woman scream that often? I have to question that, where it's like, okay, you would think like couldn't we just have a moment where she just throws her voice out to where all of a sudden like she can't scream that much, or she can't scream that loudly, or scream that annoyingly? I'm a person that doesn't like sound in horror films, because a lot of times I'll simply get scared because of a sound, not because of whatever anyone is to be doing. So I get scared at crappy parts because really it comes down to a sound and not like an actual good quality scare. So, and plus also I get annoyed of over screaming women in a movie. It gets really annoying. You don't see the men screaming all that often, because a lot of them, you'd eventually find out that guys scream like women too, like, ah, like, yeah, you scream like a woman. That's why guys don't scream in horror movies, because they would, of course, sound like women. They probably would. And so that's why you don't actually see them like scream in movies, because they couldn't have probably figured out how to actually yell or scream or whatever in a movie to make them not sound like a girl. So obviously. So eventually Sally is to be put in the mix of this dinner, and so all of a sudden we end up having this grandfather who is to seemingly have this kind of grayish or like the most like weirdest looking skin tone color, whatever. I'm not sure if this is either this character being in a mask or not. I'm assuming that he is in a mask. And we end up having Leatherface, who weirdly has this like white skin mask where it looks like very clown-ish. It's really weird. So eventually we have at one point where weirdly Sally's finger is to get opened up to eventually have this finger being served up with Sally's hand still being attached to it. Like basically, like imagine like somebody just grabbing this girl's finger and putting it into supposedly the grandfather's mouth, where he is just sucking up this girl's blood through her finger. And eventually, I think at some point, this girl eventually ends up passing out. So after this great luscious dinner where Sally's just screaming for her life, and eventually like all the family is to like kind of just eventually play with her. Eventually what happens is that now they're just going to force this girl to eventually put her head nearby this bucket so the grandfather can smack this girl on the head with this hammer. And so basically this grandfather is to be given this hammer, and he consistently keeps dropping it, and like it gets to a point where eventually Leatherface eventually is to like try and help this grandfather go and smack this girl on the head, but like they're stretching so much time here, getting this activity done because the grandfather just can't do it. So eventually we just have a moment where, because of this happening, Sally eventually just escapes because of this moment. And so she ends up just like running uh, like heck, freaking just away from these people. And then eventually, while she's running, the hitchhiker guy is also running after her. The Leatherface guy is to also be running after her. And so eventually, what ends up happening is there is to be accidentally some trucker who accidentally runs over the hitchhiker character. And so all of a sudden, Sally is to find a guy with some truck. And so she ends up getting into the truck and then drives off. And so now Leatherface is to just be like kind of wielding this chainsaw crazily, and like that's eventually how the movie is to just rattle off. And I'm just like, okay, so like you would have thought that like they would have called the police and everything would have been squared away, that Leatherface would have been put away for jail forever, and this whole thing would have been resolved, or eventually Sally wouldn't have gotten away and Sally would have ended up dead. Uh you would have also just naturally also assumed, because here's the goofy thing. Supposedly, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie was supposedly based on true events, which I guess, like, this is another one of those scenarios where they kind of just faked that. So eventually people could be like, oh, let's try to spread the lore or the story of this thing to eventually have this thing be like uh where like it's kind of like the Blair Witch Project, like it's kind of like the same thing where eventually that is to supposedly be based on some kind of footage that someone is to have found, and it's to have been like a realistic thing and whatever. And then eventually you see at an MTV movie award somewhere that all these three actors are to be alive and well, like, hey guys, we got you, suck it. And then you're like, ah, like it kind of feels like that same exact scenario where like eventually you're to find out that, oh, this is based on true events, but they were really just saying that so that way they could sell some tickets, which just seems like a garbage thing to do. But when really looking at all of it, like all these movies are to really just be a fictional thing for the most point, uh, because like they don't have the actual it's not a documentary, so every bit of this could be fiction, or maybe there is some kind of something sliveringly that it actually came from some story somewhere that they eventually just gone on to eventually just put together this movie. So with that said, I am going to get out of here. Hopefully I did this one okay. There was some efforts that I really just didn't go into this one. Oh, the old man ends up taking and beating Sally with a broom? Really? A broom? And then eventually he ends up going and taking her and putting her in his vehicle. And then eventually he ends up seeing the hitchhiker guy and he ends up beating him up because, like, hey, where were you? And hitchhiker guy's like, hey man, like I was hitchhiking, I was making my way back home, and so on and so forth. I was finding people and so on and so, and this guy was getting like beaten up and whatever. So eventually, I think Sally eventually got out of the vehicle and was trying to run off again, to try to get out of there. But eventually, they caught her and they eventually like forced her to dinner. So, yeah. So with that said, I hope that I've covered everything, especially all the goofy parts, because this feels like a goofy movie to me. It did like it shouldn't be a comedy, but it just feels like such a goofy movie in the weirdest, goofiest way. I guess where I think in the sequel movie like the sequel movie, the actual real sequel movie, where like the not the next generation weird goofy film with Matthew McConaughey just going like woohoo, like him like being so over the top, it's ridiculous. Uh, like no, the actual like sequel movie where like they end up having a lot more goofier characters in the sequel movie compared to I guess the original. But yeah, so with that said, I think that's all that I wanted to say about this. Really, it's a very simple film. And with that said, I'm going to simply get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.